I'm with Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, India's former ambassador to Japan, a retired diplomat, but somebody who knows the Asia Pacific very well. And Tanvi Madan, the director of the India project at the Brookings Institution, a very well-known think tank in Washington, DC. And I'm connecting the time zones, of course, with Tanvi in DC and with Ambassador Wadhwa right here in Delhi, like me. And today we are talking about the Quad Summit, just concluded, only the second Quad Summit that's taken place in person. Of course, this was the fourth version of it. 4 countries, India, the US, Australia, and Japan. A new Australian Prime Minister from the Labour Party actually made it, which was actually really quite interesting. Prime Minister Modi is back in India, and there is a joint statement. But before I ask both of you ladies, welcome to the Print Debates. So, Ambassador Wadhwa, can I start with you? You've been in Japan. This summit has just taken place in Japan. Prime Minister Modi has had, of course, bilateral meetings as well with the Japanese Prime Minister. But what was interesting, I thought, about the Quad Summit is that in the joint statement that emerged from it, right on top it said that the Quad is a force for good. I mean, it almost sounded like we were playing Star Wars or something, and then there are the good guys and the bad guys, and clearly the Quad, the 4 countries, are a force for good. Your first comments.
Are you surprised? Because I think what we're saying is, without saying it, that, contrast it with the others who are not forces for good. And I think when you go through that statement, you see it everywhere. We haven't named, for example, neither Russia nor China has been named, but it's not difficult to identify at different parts of the statement, what and which country we are alluding to when we talk about, various transgressions or the importance of the international, rule-based order in the world and who are not in keeping with it and so on. So I think the Quad.
So which country are you alluding, or which country is joint statement?
China for sure. Because I think the reference to Russia is of course not mentioned. And I think, Russia really has been treated quite softly in this, because they only talk about Ukraine in the context of the humanitarian crisis, and they talk about the tragic conflict, the tragic humanitarian crisis. But of course, there is, without China being named, the contrast, your question being that, why is it a force for good? And I said the contrast is with, what Quad is not. And what are the rules that they're trying to bring into the rules of play that they're trying to bring into the Indo-Pacific, which is what China is not. But I do want to say that I think when they say that's a force for good, there's something important that I discern out of the summit, is what they're saying is that this is not only about 4 of us working together, Quad partners, but equally, I think it is about working with other members of the Indo-Pacific. Of course, they mentioned the EU and the ASEAN is there, but I think of, the Quad, without mentioning the Quad Plus, but working on issues with other countries of the Indo-Pacific. And I do see here a reach out to, I think, the Pacific Islands in light of what has happened recently with the Solomons.
After Solomon Islands, okay.
Yeah.
Tanvi, can I come to you? And again, some of these statements really stand out, perhaps for us here in India more than for any other country, because India is the only sort of not an ally of the US, the others are. But even on the Twitter timeline of the spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs, Arindam Bagchi, he says things like, the Quad is committed to a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, undermined by a rules-based order. Now, for the longest time, I think India has been gnashing its teeth at this phrase, rules-based order. I mean, whose rules are they anyway? But clearly, it seems to me like India's fallen in line.
Actually, what's interesting is that it's the kind of US and Australia that have picked up this phrase, rules-based order, from India and Japan, which in many ways preferred it to liberal international order.
What's the difference between the two?
I think partly recognizing that specifically when they even came up with free and open Indo-Pacific, what did the free mean? And I think, the US, for example, when it first came up, was talking about that, an ideal version of countries should be democracies. But I think, for the way that Japan and India in particular saw it, and I think that has now been embraced, including by the US and Australia, is this idea that it's about freedom to choose, make choices. And it's so it doesn't matter whether you are kind of what the nature of your own regime is, it is about the way you behave in the region. So also pointing to, this is not about China's rise per se, as China likes to put it, but about China's behavior, that it is acting in ways that challenge the rules in the region. And, India might say that, look, people whose rules, and for one, India was actually present at the creation of several of those rules. Second, it is in India's interest as a country that is going to have, for the first time perhaps in its history, a superpower at its doorstep that is 5.5 to 6 times India's economic size, 3 times in terms of its military budget, to have rules followed. Because if it comes down to just power, not rules, then India is in trouble too. So I think this idea that rules-based order, I actually think, is somewhere even the region. In fact, before she was in office, Senator Penny Wong, just a month or so ago, gave who's
now the Australian foreign minister. Yeah.
Yes, she gave a speech where they asked her about, is this democracies versus autocracies, as President Biden likes to say, and sometimes Prime Minister Modi as well, in a different way, of course. She said, look, we are in a region that has very different kinds of governments and regimes, and we want this to be as inclusive as possible, which at the end of the day is also India's position. How would you bring in countries like Vietnam, for example, otherwise? And I think now you've seen with the US Indo-Pacific strategy also talking about, it's about countries that follow the rules. And as the Quad statement put it, sharing an interest with partners who share the vision of the region, which is free, open, inclusive, secure, and prosperous.
Okay. Ambassador Wadhwa, what was interesting, I thought, is around the time that the summit was concluding in Japan, both Russian and Chinese jets were in the area. And I'm not saying they buzzed the summit or they sort of came that close. But was it a signal, do you think? And I should have said right in the introduction that Ambassador Wadhwa has served in China and speaks Chinese, knows the Chinese very well. So perhaps you have a comment, an inside comment on this.
Without a doubt, I don't think the timing was a coincidence at all, because apparently that this is the first joint exercise that they've had after Ukraine started. They had done exercises before. And I know that they haven't violated the airspace of Japan, but I think the Japanese have been very upset about it and have protested and so on. So obviously there's some sort of signaling there. As much as statements that have been coming out, I suppose, from, not particularly India, but others of the Quad partners. So right. I think there was a strong signaling over there. And you've seen, which is a bit surprising. I mean, once seeing the Chinese, the statements from whether it's Wang Yi or you're getting pretty strong about the Quad. They seem to be concerned actually in a way that cooperation, it's not really cooperation, it's not, just joint sort of high sounding statements and principles, but I think the fact that you're doing things actually and you're trying to operationalize these things and setting up working groups and that there are tangible outcomes, I think that perhaps is also getting to them to a certain extent.
Tanvi, to you, the question is, well, two questions. The first is, the Quad has talked about issues like, and in fact, actually this time the statement was much more in detail, where it speaks about critical and emerging technologies, cybersecurity, climate, infrastructure, global health, that kind of thing. But, what seems to be missing is the fact that that the Quad still doesn't want to be a security organization. Are you surprised?
I actually think it doesn't want to be just a security organization. And I don't even know if we can call it an organization, right? It is a fairly flexible group.
Let's say coalition. Perhaps that might be.
So I think, but security is there throughout, if you think about it, in the statement, even if they don't kind of point it out in the way of saying, look, this is an alliance or anything. Part of that is, in fact, to address something Ambassador Wadhwa mentioned, which is that China has been trying to frame this as a destabilizing Asian NATO that is an exclusive security club, and this goes back to the Quad saying we want to provide we want to be the regional solutions provider, not just regional security provider. But that doesn't mean the Quad is not doing the regional security provider role. Now, some might think it's not doing it fast enough. But if you look at a few, I'll just mention a few different elements, even in the joint statement, you see this. If you look at the kind of cybersecurity paragraph in both the joint statement and the fact sheet that also came out, that is worth looking at. It is about defending the Quad countries' critical infrastructure. Now, that is including detecting threats and addressing them in a coordinated or joint fashion. It's also about kind of, if you talk about maritime domain awareness and improving that, and providing that facility to various countries in the region. That's not just about dealing with climate and other humanitarian disasters, for example, or natural disasters, but actually about stringing together this information that will help regional security, but also maritime security in a very targeted way.
But can I say here that fine, China is sort of the big dragon in the room, or the elephant in the room, or whatever animal you choose. But the fact remains that both the US and European Union's trade with China has actually only gone up in these last 2 years of the pandemic. So on the one hand,
India's, right? So has India. So
has
my point
India.
is,
It's crossed $100 billion.
Nobody, you can't talk about, just cutting off. This is not, people talk about deglobalization. I think that's a wrong term to use, just like decoupling was. I think what you're going to see is a different kind of globalization. You see the word resilience mentioned repeatedly throughout the Quad statement. Part of this is, think about it as the Quad having two lines of effort. One is shaping a favorable balance of power to deter China. The second is building resilience in the region, including building resilient economies. So you're not stopping engagement that would actually benefit your societies and citizens, but making sure that China can't use those economic ties to coerce or influence you in ways, country, and not just the Quad member states, but others.
Yeah, but how do you do that, Ambassador Wadhwa? I mean, I know you were ambassador in Japan, and especially in the wake of the pandemic, there have been a lot of efforts by diplomats as well as leaders to try and diversify, say Japan, for example, businesses who were in China and bring them to India. But that hasn't really happened. So this word resilience doesn't really mean very much, or is it too soon?
The point is, of course, it is not going to happen overnight. It's taken a long time, for China to be what it is. And I think it is this kind of the manufacturing hub of the world because of really, Quad partners such as Japan, US, and Australia over time. So this is not going to happen suddenly, but certainly there is a serious intent to want to diversify supply chains. And as Tanvi mentions, yes, resilience is used constantly, several times in this document, but they also talk about supply chains. And it was interesting that one of the, I think, statements in one of the sentences in this statement, they talk about mapping, semiconductor supply chains. So I think what they're really trying to do is, certainly move away from this overdependence and, to see what you can do to work, without China. And this is among the four Quad. Besides options to the countries, which certainly is certainly there. This is going to take some time. And I think this IPEF also.
The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
Yes, the Economic Framework for Prosperity. Which Biden, I think, had promised about a year ago and has sort of has been launched. I think, what is the purpose of that? The purpose of that also, because one is to say that, the US continues to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific and that it is the most economically dynamic region. But it's also talking about, giving options for even US companies to move out of China into other countries of the region. So the whole thing is, I think this diversification certainly is important intent.
But has the US made that decision, Tanvi, to diversify its own, whether it's trade or other economic cooperation, bring, say, companies, and I'm interested in India, of course, but has the penny dropped inside the US that it has to diversify?
I think so. I think that, it is going to be challenging and it's going to take time. But yes, you've seen, especially in critical sectors, both for strategic and economic reasons. So there are companies who, are doing it for economic reasons where they say that, look, what COVID taught them more than anything else was, with China being such a big part of their manufacturing, they had created a single point of failure. And so you don't actually want that, even if there was nothing going on the geopolitical side. But I think because of strategic competition, but also particularly because we have enough evidence that China's actually used economic ties and vulnerabilities, rather than what the hope had been, not just in the US, but in India as well, that economic ties would alleviate political frictions. We've actually seen that China's used those economic ties with the Quad member states, but with countries around the region, to actually influence them potentially, and actually even coerce them in certain cases.
Okay.
And so I think you have seen the US have a conversation like several other countries, which is, including in Europe, which is do a combination of reshoring and what they call friendshoring, which is try to encourage companies to go to kind of like-minded or trusted partners. Now, India's opportunity and challenge is that this creates space for India to attract some of that investment. Having said that, it is competing with other countries, including the Vietnams and Bangladeshs of this world,
right,
to be able to attract that investment.
So India has to get its act together. But Ambassador Wadhwa, to you, the Russia question. Now, perhaps the first sentence in the Quad joint statement is, we discussed our respective responses to the conflict in Ukraine and the ongoing tragic humanitarian crisis, and then it goes on. Now, India's response has been different from the others. India has refused to criticize Russia as much as the others, although it has talked about the violation of territorial integrity, etc. We know all that. But do you feel, my question is, do you believe that India, in a sense, is coming around to the viewpoints of its fellow Quad nations, and is therefore perhaps willing to be much more critical of the Russians than it was 3 months earlier when the invasion began?
Joe, I don't know really. I'm not talking about India's position vis-a-vis Russia, but in the context of the Quad, which is very clear, is that perhaps we have been a restraining factor, and that is so evident in the statement. When they talk about respective positions, it's very clear that there were no convergences on the positions, and we are the outliers, and that's very clear also. But I think what has happened is, the way I read it was that all the other three countries had very strong positions on Russia, and before this summit, there were statements of how Ukraine was going to dominate the Quad summit and so on. And this happens every time we have a bilateral summit also, whether it's with the Japanese or the Americans, they talk about Ukraine dominating it. And at the end of it, what comes out of it is, yes, that it's being discussed. And obviously it would be discussed, considering that it is such a conflict of such global importance. But really what comes out of it is that, we have been taking a stand, and I don't think we moved from it as far as our plurilateral and multilateral, fora are concerned. Whatever, if we're re-looking at our own policy on Russia, that's a completely different thing. But here, I think we've held our own, and we continue to say that, the humanitarian aspects are the most important, that this is something that the war has to end, that this has to be resolved through diplomacy. So, all of that, and of course, as you mentioned, territorial integrity, sovereignty, what have you. And I think that's very much our line. And I thought I saw that reflected in the joint statement.
Tanvi, the same question to you. India has held firm, as Ambassador Wadhwa says, that India's position is different. But do you believe that, or do you see from these conversations around you that India is perhaps coming closer to the positions that the other Quad nations are taking on Russia and Ukraine?
I think, you've seen India's position evolve, but independently of the Quad meeting, in the sense that, and it's fair to actually discuss, how could you meet and not discuss, the Russia-Ukraine war, given its implications, which clearly were discussed for the Indo-Pacific, including Russia-China relations, the kind of doing an exercise together. They've done it before. But again, the fact that it's been pushing them closer together, but also in terms of the food and energy security implications, economic security was mentioned. I suspect Sri Lanka came up, even though it wasn't mentioned explicitly, you did see it kind of implied that it was discussed. So I think, because it's natural that it was discussed, and it's fine. The Quad are like-minded, they're not same-minded on everything. Having said that, I think, you have seen India's position, for instance, You saw Prime Minister Modi's conversations with President Putin haven't happened for a while, but over the three conversations get progressively more kind of stern in some ways, I guess, if you can look at that, where he said to him, you need to talk to President Zelensky, which President Putin has refused to do. In fact, doesn't even recognize him as kind of a legitimate leader of Ukraine. You've seen India drop references to legitimate security interests of all countries, or that this is a Russia-NATO problem. And you've seen India be critical of Russia for example, shelling nuclear facilities or spreading disinformation, and also pushing back when President Putin himself said the Ukrainians were taking Indians hostage, and doing that very explicitly from an MEA statement.
I know,
so
but that's
India has done that for its own reasons, and I think partly because India is seeing how much this Russian invasion and its fallout has done for India's direct interest, security, economic, energy, food security, in ways that the longer this continues, it'll become worse.
No, absolutely. I think, we've had the wheat ban, for example, there's this on-off wheat ban and other issues. But Ambassador Wadhwa, the point is that even if Russia's bleeding and this is roiling the international security scenario, but the fact remains that the Russians are getting their way in Ukraine. They've taken Mariupol, so which basically means that they have the Black Sea under control. And to whatever cost, I'm sure the costs are huge, of course, to the Ukrainians, but also to the Russians themselves. So what is your view on how India wants to, or how is India looking at this 3 months on?
I think I completely agree with Tanvi, because we certainly want to see the end of it. I mean, look at the implications, not only for the Indo-Pacific, look at the implication for the global economic order.
What are the implications for the Indo-Pacific?
The implications for the Indo-Pacific, I think, basically to do with energy pricing, to do with food security. You talked about, wheat exports and so on. So, and this is going to, I mean, there's no one who's going to be unaffected in this globalized world. So I think we certainly do want to see the end of this. And it isn't like, we've had relations with Ukraine. And, when Prime Minister Modi went to Europe, I'm sure that, he had some fairly frank conversations with the Europeans. And our major concern really in all of this was that, this would really, on the other side, was this push Russia closer to the Chinese, which wouldn't help, wouldn't really help us, because, we've had to depend on them for various resolutions, the UN Security Council, and other, even when we've had issues, I think, with China on the border, we believe that, the Russians do have some sort, at least have the ear of the Chinese, not the Chinese particularly listen to them. So, I mean, there's just too much.
You don't think the Chinese are listening to them?
I don't think what.
You said, I just heard, perhaps I misheard you, but just a question. You said the Chinese are not listening to the Russians?
No, I mean, in the context of India, I'm sure, as one knew that, the Russians did speak about, the incursions in Ladakh and so on to the Chinese. I mean, what I mean is, it isn't as if just because Russians are taking it up, the Chinese are going to listen. But I mean, Russia has been a friend, I'm not, the defense, the link on, defense equipment and spares and so on is well known. But it has been a friend, sort of a time-tested friend. But on the other hand, I think, it's a balance of concerns. On one hand, yes, you have a country which has, stood by you through various, difficult moments in your relationships with particularly the United States. And on one hand, you have, their behavior right now, which I don't think any right-thinking country believes the rule of law. And I'll come back to that rule of law a little bit. I did want to mention that. Is that India is part of that rule-making process. We are fine with the rules. Our only problem is when we are not part of the process. I mean, that is the only thing that bothers us.
So say that again. I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
I said, the whole thing about India being opposed to a rule-based order, India is not. If you are part of the rule-making process, we are fine. You see, if you are involved, if you are part of the rule-making process, I think India is fine. And therefore, I was talking about something which was mentioned earlier about sort of India's hesitations in the past on this whole issue of having, a rule-based order. I was saying that India doesn't have problems in being a rule-based order as long as we are part of the process that sets the rules.
I think that's really interesting. But then the question is the Quad perhaps making the rules in the Indo-Pacific?
No, I think it's trying to ensure that the rules are maintained. The rules have been in place for ages, and various countries have signed on to it. China, despite what it says that it wasn't present at the creation, it did help negotiate UNCLOS as well, the United Nations Law of the Sea, and so the rules are in place. I think what we've seen though over the recent years, and in India's mind, this tracks back to about 2008, 2009, after the global financial crisis, that increasingly China violating the rules, norms, laws in the region in ways that are destabilizing for India, but also for various countries in the region, including not just and for example, in the India-China case, those kind of rules and norms include the boundary agreements that were signed, commitments by both countries to follow certain rules, which China has. So it might not be international law in the kind of UN sense, but it was kind of agreements made by both countries that China has violated in recent years. So, I do think in that sense, you are seeing the Quad trying to ensure. Now, it is incumbent upon the Quad members themselves to follow the rules and norms as well. And let's just say it's not just the US. I don't think Quad member states of various varieties have in the past fallen short themselves. But I do think, if you're going to say you're there to kind of preserve the rules-based order, it means ensuring that you try to follow them as much as possible yourself.
Master Wadhwa, the Chinese troops have been sitting on the line of actual control in Ladakh, in Eastern Ladakh, for the last 2 years. How does being part of the Indo-Pacific or the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, how does it help India deal with the Chinese in the Himalayas?
Jyoti, I'm very much a product of the Ministry of External Affairs, where, I really see the Quad, we defined it, I think, as an informal grouping. I certainly don't see it as a security, based or grouping which is anything like close to an alliance or close to anything that is security focused. Having said that, certainly, support from the Quad members. That I think is important for us. But being part of the Quad or any of these Quad actions, whether that is going to in any way deter what China does on the borders, I really don't believe that will happen.
Tanvi, you've just come back from Australia. There is a new government in Australia, the Labour Party, and both the Prime Minister, Mr. Anthony Albanese, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, were in Japan. What's your take on how the Labour Party's sort of relationship with China and its participation in the Quad? Are they as committed as their predecessors?
So I'll come to that. I just want to address your question about the Himalayas question as well, because it is related, I think, also to the Australian question. I think, one thing about the Quad is we see it as we just see it as the Quad, countries doing things collectively. But it's also beneath that, it's built on stronger bilaterals. And I think you saw during the 2020 crisis, the only countries, in fact, in the world that supported India vocally were the Quad member states, the other Quad member states, and supported its positions. The US obviously went further, fast-tracking equipment, providing intelligence, etc. But I think that's where that's helpful. I think there's also, for example, we tend to think that a border crisis will stay a continental crisis. That's not necessarily the case. It will be cyber, it'll be maritime, and this is where Quad capacity building, but also potentially far more than that, including the intelligence cooperation relationship. And there is now a Quad strategic intelligence forum that exists and engages. These things will help. So I think we need to think about these crises in more holistic manners. And then you start to see where these relationships, whether the trilaterals, bilaterals, Quad, but at the end of the day, it's India's choice that India who's going to have boots on the ground? It will be India, but there are things that countries can do to support and enable. Just on the Labour Party, I think one thing is, this is not the Australian Labour Party of 2007, 2008 that did not agree with the Quad and had a very different view of China. I think one thing is very clear when you visit Australia in particular, but also even otherwise, how much the view of China has changed considerably. A much more, because Beijing's own action, particularly two things. One is economic coercion and very blatant economic coercion, and second, foreign interference in their politics. And I think you've seen both these things really also change the public mood. So what was striking to me is even during the election campaign, China came up constantly, and each party was kind of competing to be kind of more, say, we'll be more competitive. But I will say, just one thing on that. I think that in and of itself, we've seen the new prime minister and the new foreign minister say they're committed to the Quad, also committed to a bilateral relationship with India. The question will be, I think, for many, which is we'll watch and see actions. But I think in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of where Australia is on China policy, on India policy, on the Quad, it's a very different relationship, a set of relationships and views than it was. And I think they should be given the benefit of the doubt. And there are things that India can do that can make sure that position, more assertive position remains.
Yeah. So last couple of questions to both of you. Ambassador Wadhwa, you referred earlier to the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum for Prosperity. Now the question is, India, very much part of this IPEF, which was held one day before the Quad Summit, but India has refused to join earlier the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, perhaps because it was led by China, also the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the US led earlier on in its earlier incarnation, I think when President Barack Obama was president. So why has India joined up the IPEF with such alacrity when it wasn't interested in other economic and trading organizations like the RCEP?
Sure. I really don't think, first of all, that this is a trade pact. Here, this is when you're talking about, making of rules. I think one of the things that President Biden said was that, this is going to be a process of, I think, writing of rules on trade, on, there's this whole list of things on anti-corruption, on what else was it, resilience, supply chains, and so on. I don't think that the US has an appetite for a trade pact, as you know. And so they have something which is going to facilitate greater trade, outside of China in the region, which will be short of a trade agreement, so to speak. And I think that suits us. But I'm not sure that we didn't have hesitations. I don't know anything from within the system. But I think the response was cautious to the extent that we said that we would start consultations to begin with and then move on to negotiations. So we're just at the beginning of a process. And, I just don't know what the end of this is going to be. And, is it going to be binding agreements among them? We really don't have much of an idea right now.
This is the IPEF you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so India is still sort of cautiously.
No, it isn't. I mean, we've joined the process, but it's kind of the unveiling, I think they said, of this framework. And this would begin consultations. And after the consultations, and it's not only the Quad, as you know, the 12 or 13 other countries, and then move on to some phase when, you can go into negotiations. There was also very strange, at the beginning when President Biden spoke about it, he also said that there were these pillars. And at that point of time, I think he was talking about 7 pillars or so, and said that people could join on to or countries could join on to what they wanted. So we've got to see how this is really going to pan out and how it's going to work. And I'm sure that's our position. That, if I know our system, that's what we are trying to do. Wait and see.
Right. So Tanvi, President Biden came to Japan for the IPEF as well as for the Quad Summit with the lowest ratings that he has had in the last 2 years in power. Now, does he have the stomach, or does his party have the stomach to follow through? Elections to the lower house are in the offing. He may or may not win. His party may or may not win those. So does the US have does it have the muscle? Does it want to follow through? How powerful is it in this whole taking on China business?
I think, it's for American presidents, they generally have more leeway on foreign policy than they do on several other issues. Of course, these days, part of the challenge, and you see this in the US reluctance on trade is that foreign policy issues do get kind of intertwined with several domestic policy issues. Having said that, I think, you have seen the US, even in its Indo-Pacific strategy, say that, look, we don't and we cannot do this alone in terms of balancing China, providing an alternative. That is both kind of especially politically unsustainable, I think, for the US. But I think that's a recognition shared by the Quad member states. Just to come back to the Quad, I think part of the reason the Quad exists is that each of the member states realizes that you can't do this alone, and they don't want to do this alone.
Even the US, which is the most powerful country in the world, even the US can't go it alone.
Well, if they wanted to, they could. But the thing is, then you become a society and an economy on a war footing. There is a recognition that, that China is kind of a different level of power. And the one thing I would watch is Secretary of State Blinken will be giving a speech. It was delayed because he had COVID in the past. But on Thursday, he's going to give a speech on the administration's China strategy. But they do call it the pacing challenge. Now we'll have to see whether resources are adequately devoted to it. But the US is the most powerful, as Prime Minister Modi has put it, indispensable power at the end of it in terms of balancing China. One of the reasons India embraced the Quad was to try to keep the US anchored in the region. India has changed its mind about US power and presence in the region. It was something India, for example, resisted in the Indian Ocean, now welcomes, because there's a recognition that it's necessary. And I think the US is, some of us say devoting not enough resources, but a considerable amount of resources. One question will be how much is the war in Europe, the post the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how much is that going to, for example, distract or take resources? I think part of President Biden's effort to do these meetings in Asia was to say, look, we are still very focused on the Indo-Pacific. And if you see, even within the Quad, there are resource commitments as well. Now we'll just have to see follow through.
So, Ambassador Wadhwa, India has traditionally been quite cautious about America's enthusiasm about new initiatives. And but this time around, as Tanvi's pointed out, actually Prime Minister Modi has embraced the US much more. I mean, of course, I remember Prime Minister Vajpayee, former Prime Minister Vajpayee, talking about the US as a natural ally in the wake of India's nuclear tests. But this somehow seems much more grounded in the sense that, it's 20 years on, India is a larger country, there's more economic trade and cooperation. But do you feel that India and the US are coming closer together, or is it still India being more cautious about the relationships it wants to have with a variety of nations?
I don't think so at all. I think the US is one of our most important relationships, and absolutely without a doubt. And you can see this. One of the things is that one of the Quad kind of the meetings that they have, these summits, they give you opportunities for bilaterals. And I was very surprised at the substantive bilateral that there has been between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden. They've actually had 2 agreements which came away from it. And I was thinking to myself, I mean, am I making a mistake? Because I went and looked at the joint statement of the bilateral or the readout of the bilateral. I mean, there've been very major announcements made out of it. So, and I think, the words that were used, if I remember, were warm and, something about President Biden saying that India will be sort of the closest, he wants to build the closest relationship with India and so on. So the relationship, I think, whatever hesitations, I mean, relations between countries go through various drops and highs. I think this is perhaps, a moment in our relationship where certainly it's not only very multifaceted, it's, it's sort of, the agenda is huge. It's a sort of deepening in every sort of sphere that we can think of. I don't think we have hesitations any longer on the US. I mean, we would have issues where we are not 100% with them, convergences like you're talking about, Ukraine or something. But nobody thinks if you have relations between 2 countries that you've got to agree on everything. But a
second question to you, Ambassador Wadhwa, which is that, it's only 2 months since a slew of Western leaders came to town, and I'm talking about the US Deputy National Security Advisor, Dileep Singh. Tanvi was in an earlier discussion with me, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Tanvi, but this one to Ambassador Wadhwa. Just 2 months ago, Dileep Singh, the US Deputy National Security Advisor, was warning India, saying that if it that if India continued to buy oil from Russia and do business with Russia, there would be serious repercussions or consequences. And today you're talking about a much warmer.
No, I think different people, there have been different voices coming out of the US. And I think on balance, they've been balanced and understanding, perhaps not agreeing, but understanding that we have a position on Ukraine. And I see more understanding in the US position than these, odd statements that we've had from people that as you mentioned, is the lip sync. So, and I think over time, that is what one is seeing, both with, at least that's my own reading of Europe and the US.
And why do you think the Americans have moved? Why do you think the criticism has stopped and the Americans have sort of moved on?
Well, I don't know whether their own position on what's happening in Europe is changing. I mean, the Europeans themselves are not very happy with these, the situation, the sanctions against Russia. They're being affected by the, them trying to turn off the energy gap, the taps. So I don't know whether there's a relook at it, but I think we have a reasoned position. There is perhaps, at the end of the day, if you want to have relationships, close relationships, you've got to understand when you have divergences.
Tanvi, the same question to you. Do you think the US has moved on? What's happened? And there's so much warmth and joy and sort of embracing each other, both Prime Minister Modi and President Biden. Very good thing, of course. But what's happened?
I think there were two things, and I think I mentioned when I was on your show previously that for one, a lot of the voices that people were citing weren't people in the administration.
The lip sync definitely was. He's the deputy.
Let me come to that. That's my second point. I know you and I have a long conversation about the lip sync, but the second thing is, as I mentioned at the time, look at what he was there to do. And other than his one line, there will be consequences. Most of his meeting, and both sides said they were very constructive meetings, was about discussing what the sanctions were and were not, what India could do, what it could not. And second, if these things went into place, what the impact on India would be. He didn't go elsewhere, and he wasn't there to threaten India. That was how it was seen, of course. But the point being, to me, it's that both countries have come to an understanding also, I think, that when you have broader strategic convergence, this is not the first time in US-India history this has happened. When there's broader strategic convergence, you make an effort to manage your differences better. And I think that's what you're seeing. For both countries, they don't want to essentially give Russia a veto on the relationship and let these divergences, which frankly are about a divergence of approach. Both countries agree that violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty is wrong, and the use of force is wrong. So the objective is not different, that both countries want a cessation of hostilities, but it's the approach that the two countries disagree on. And when you do that, it's about managing your divergences and not letting it overcome all the strategic convergences, and particularly the major strategic convergence you have on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's what a mature relationship does. But I think it's also incumbent upon us who's sitting on the outside to also, follow what the governments and the Indian government and the Biden administration are saying, rather than, what folks on the outside are saying. And as you said, look, do I think the lip sync songs should not have said, that, there will be consequences? Yeah, but I also think the broader visit, which he was there for, actually apparently was constructive and went well, but we choose not to focus on that.
I think the point that the two of you are making, that when you have something much bigger in front of you, the convergences that are staring you in the face in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's China or anything else, then both countries learn to manage the differences. Thank you so much, both of you, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa here in New Delhi and Tanvi Madan from Washington, DC. Thank you so much for joining me on the Print Debates.
Thank you, Jyoti.
Thank you.